This is the new 2019 Tao Motor TBR7 250 Enduro. It is a street legal dirt bike made in China that sells retail for $1,350 brand new, delivered to your house. A sharp looking bike, but in my case not a perfect looking one. I bought this bike to ride, and ride it I have. Roughly 1,500 miles, and I say roughly because, well, I don't know. A few months ago I was coming through the woods and a tree ripped out my speedometer cable, so 1,100 miles on the clock is where we sit. There is but one good reason to buy this motorcycle, and that's the price. It is made in China, hence the reason for the significant dip in that price versus other bikes. And I think that for that money, you get a lot. This bike, it does come in a crate, but it's like 90% put together. You do have to put the front wheel on, the handlebars, all the controls. Getting it out of the crate by myself was actually the hardest part. You do also need to go over everything that was put together at the factory on this, because some of it was not put together well at all. Aside from that, once it is together, mine started right up. I hit the switch and it just rolled. In this video, I'm going to compare this bike to a couple of other things. You will hear me talk about it versus a Japanese bike, my XT250, and you will also hear me compare it to the RPS Hawk, which is a very similar bike. I do not have that bike, but it's something very, very common that other people who are into these Chinese bikes do have. Initially, after doing a whole lot of reading on China Riders Forum, I decided on the Tao versus the Hawk for two main reasons, and that's because these tires right here, I wanted to get a more on-road tire. I wanted to be as safe on the highway as I could. I think these tires are about an 80-20 tire. They do very well on the pavement and quite respectably actually off-road too. I can tell a difference between a good set of knobbies and those when I'm on the dirt, especially if it's wet outside, but they do a reasonable job. The other thing that I chose this bike for versus the RPS is it has this rack on the tail end. I wanted to have that. Some additional features that you get with this bike are we have a somewhat adjustable suspension. You can adjust the preload on the rear end, and we also have this tool container. Out of the box, this was an incredibly tall bike. And the way it sat, the seat height was above my hip, and I had to kick my leg up higher than my waist to even get it over that. I was lacked 4 inches touching the ground on both sides. Because I don't weigh a lot, I was able to simply adjust the rear suspension sag. I put it almost all the way down to the bottom. That gained me a couple of inches. And also on the front end, I removed the spacers that are inside the shocks. And I also lowered the place where the tree grips the shocks too. Those two things combined made me be able to touch almost flat foot on the bike. Because I did that, I also had to cut the kickstand because even out of the box, it was way too tall. Even for the way the bike was set up, the bike would fall over sometimes. Like 5 people are going to realize the significance of what I just showed here. I would say that the engine of this bike is probably its best feature. Not only did it start right up when I put it together, it's very, very torquey. I love that it has so much power on the low end. Its gear ratio is fairly low. Unfortunately, the gears are pretty close together, but that does mean that this bike will sit up for you all day long. You don't even have to use the clutch to get the front end in the air. With this bike, we did get a decent headlight, LED turn signals, disc brakes on the front. We got a drum brake on the rear. Now, there is another version of this that's come out since I purchased mine that I heard does come with a disc brake on the rear, but I bought mine around Thanksgiving of last year, even though it is a 2019, so I have the drum brake on mine. If you're looking for a cheap adventure bike, this one will get you some places. I have really got a lot of hills and canyons and valleys and stuff like that where I live, and I also will just take off riding straight through the woods or following the power lines, things like that. And most of the time, this bike's capability exceeds mine. That said, when I see something, most of the time I go for it anyway. All right, any wagers? Good thing we didn't bet. So clearly it rained more last night than what I thought it did. Yesterday we got up that just fine, but all my footage was garbage because I wore the GoPro on my chest. Admittedly, yesterday was the first time I ever made it up that on this bike though. The knobbies really help, and in the mud, these tires are not good. A better rider probably could do it, but this rider's just gonna take the other way home. It has plenty of power getting through the trails and up the hills. The top speed is around 60 miles an hour. I don't particularly care for going that fast on this bike because it is so low geared. You are squalling going down the road. I don't feel particularly safe on it going that fast, but it does a great job in the woods. Whoa, that was so deep. Overall, it runs pretty well, but there are definitely some problems with it. I chose this bike over a used Enduro at the $1,300 price point because I felt like I was getting a known problem set, and I'm going to tell you what that set is because there's some doozies. The first thing that you'll have to do with this bike right out of the box is either change the carburetor or cut open the one you've got and modify it. It will run, but it lacks power and they sputter like crazy. That's when you get on the throttle and you start to accelerate or you've got it open and it cuts out and cuts out and cuts out. I chose to go with buying the Mikuni carburetor that I found out about on China Rider forums, but YouTuber MOTOCHEEZ has shown on his channel a solution that works too.
Tamper-proof screws, so we got to fix that. And it's got the tamper-proof mixture adjustment.
If you go with the Mikuni carburetor, the magic numbers are the 110 jet. The needle should be 2 clicks from the top, and the fuel screw was turned 2 turns out. When I put that carburetor on, it squalled. Huge jump in power and eliminated all of the sputtering issues. Some of the other things you need to know are when you are putting this together, you have got to double check everything, and China Rider forums is a great place. They have lists of stuff you need to check on these. Like I found the fuel line was not hooked up to the carburetor, even though all of that section was put together. I also found that the front end was not tightened down correctly, and I didn't notice this at first. I put the bike together and I rode it around for a bit and I heard this thump in there, and this is what I discovered. The chain tension may need to be adjusted. And one other thing that was probably the worst thing of all about this is when I got mine, the rear wheel was stiff. It would bind up. And I looked and looked and looked and tried to figure out what was wrong, checking to see if the brakes were doing that. The spec on it is something like 60 or 64 pounds you're supposed to be able to torque it to. At like 5 pounds, it would start making that squeak noise, and by 10 pounds, the rear wheels locked up. The bearings were greased, they were good, And I didn't figure this out on my own. I actually mentioned it to MOTOCHEEZ to see if he had the same problem with his bike, and he told me it shouldn't matter how tight you torque that down to, that there should be spacers in between the bearings that keep that from happening. And I found that one of the main ones inside the wheel in mine had never been put in. Another issue is oil in the airbox, and it's due to the design of this right here. If I'm not mistaken, this is so that gases can escape from the crankcase and be recirculated into the airbox, but unfortunately a lot of oil goes with it. So I added this extra length of hose to make it more difficult for the oil to do that. Even with that, there still have been some times where I've had to drain oil out of my airbox. Not only is this bike inexpensive, it is cheap. The quality of materials used in this does not compare at all to a Japanese bike. On the rear end, instead of having thick aluminum tubing, we have sheet metal, basically. The welds and things on this are not nearly as good. The frame, for the most part, has stayed together. But both the rear passenger peg and the rear brake broke off on me. I was doing wheelie practice, trying to do stand wheelies. That stud that's just welded to the sheet metal right there snapped off. And so to fix that, I had to take it all apart, and I made my own stud. I happened to have a lathe, so I made one that was longer that could not only be welded to the front side, but I drilled a very small hole to the opposite side and poked it through that hole and then welded it there. I don't feel like I should have to own a lathe and a welder to operate this bike. After that passenger peg broke off, I went back and went over all of their welds, and they look terrible because I had to use my Harbor Freight $99 welder, because I don't have the 220 electricity out here for my other one. But so that brings us to what advantages does this have over my XT250? Obviously the price, but also I really like how torquey the engine is in the low range, and the weight. The weight of this bike is awesome. This bike is, I think, around 30-ish pounds lighter than my XT and significantly less top heavy. The peg position is also a major plus on this bike. They sit about 6 inches further forward than my XT250 and a couple inches lower. The XT, it feels like I'm sitting on my knees. It makes them hurt. This bike has a much more relaxed cruiser type position. Other than that, in every other category, I'm gonna have to say XT250 blows this bike out of the water. But for the extra money it costs, it should. My personal recommendation, do I recommend owning this bike? If $1,350 is the absolute maximum of your budget, I still think owning one of the Chinese bikes gives you an advantage because you get a known problem set. And you do have a problem set, but it's a known one. You're getting a brand new bike. At $1,350, the Enduros I found in my area were junk. They were like 1999s with 40,000 miles on them, which probably had black smoke, white smoke, bald tires, all of that. You're not going to get much. If you can come up to $2,000, and I'm not going to say that like, oh, just save up a few $100 more, because I know how it is. Or definitely, if you can get up to $2,400, you will get a better used bike. You can find Japanese bikes, 250s, for $2,400 with only a few thousand miles on them that are gonna blow this away. Both in performance and in quality, they're a much, much safer bike. I feel like that this bike is significantly more of a hazard to your life. You're risking your life more by buying this bike than other motorcycles. About customer service, I mentioned I got this bike at Q9 Power Sports. They were one of the very few people that actually had them when I was looking around, and I bought the bike a couple days before Thanksgiving. Within 11 days, it was sitting here in a box. What I didn't think was okay is they did not send the title at all. And not only that, they didn't plan to. I get why they don't ship it in the box, because that would make it easy to steal. But they could have very well shipped it, in the mail. The only reason I got my title is because I called them to find out why I didn't have my title. Maybe that's how it is everywhere. Maybe I'm foolish and I just don't understand how things work. This is the first internet motorcycle I ever bought. At least 4 to 6 weeks before I was able to get this bike street legal because of that. The good thing about Q9 is you can always call them and get an English-speaking person in the United States of America on the phone. When it came time to get the missing parts that I did not receive for my back wheel, I did get a response. 14 days later, they said, okay, when I contacted them again, they said, okay, we're having this shipped to you from our California warehouse. You'll have it in 3 to 5 business days. I kept, emailing back, and they'd be like, they'd just say that same story again, and I called them on the phone, and they, same story again. And so finally, I just gave up, and I didn't want to, but I made my own part on the lathe. I found out what it was supposed to look like by looking at another YouTuber's video, the shape of the part, and I just got some steel and I made my own. I put it on there, and it works perfectly. I first emailed them on April 2nd. On May 17th, a part came in the mail, UPS, not just like they said, but 6 weeks later. But you could do worse on customer service. They did actually eventually at least send the part. I'll put a link in the description to Q9 because, they do have customer service. I did get my bike. They're an okay place. I'm also going to put a link to XT Power Sports, and I've not bought from them, but YouTuber MOTOCHEEZ has several of these kind of bikes, and he seems thrilled with them. They even gave him a coupon code so that you can save some money on that, and so I'm going to put his link and his coupon code in there. I don't get anything at all from this. I don't really know him, so you'll be taking his word for it if you buy from there, but I'll put both of those sources down there so you guys can see them. As always, guys, super thanks for watching, and good lucks.